The Whittaker family was admired by everyone in their town. At the turn of the 20th century, their home stood proudly on the edge of the community, a grand estate with white columns, sprawling gardens, and a long driveway that made it feel almost like a private kingdom. John Whittaker, the head of the family, was known as a successful businessman who dealt in shipping and trade, and his wife Margaret was equally respected for her charm and generosity. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, raising 3 children who were always dressed neatly and who carried themselves with quiet discipline. People often pointed to them as an example of what hard work and tradition could build in a rapidly changing world. To an outsider, everything about them looked polished, respectable, and flawless. But behind the perfect smiles and carefully managed appearances, there were details that never quite added up. The children rarely joined in the simple games other youngsters played in the town square. Instead, they were escorted everywhere, their movements carefully watched, as though freedom itself was too dangerous a luxury. Neighbors who lived closest to the estate sometimes whispered of strange occurrences that disturbed the quiet nights. They told stories of flickering lanterns moving through the gardens after midnight, of muffled voices drifting on the wind, and of the unsettling sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. No one ever asked questions directly, because to question the Whittakers was to risk angering people with wealth and power. For many, it was easier to accept the illusion. After all, the family hosted elegant gatherings, inviting the town's most prominent figures to drink fine wine and eat elaborate meals. They gave money to the local church, they supported charity drives, and Margaret made sure her name was attached to causes that painted her as compassionate. These gestures created a shield, convincing most people that the rumors were nothing more than gossip. Anyone who dared to question what might truly be happening inside the estate was quickly silenced by the overwhelming image of perfection. Still, certain signs of unease could not be ignored forever. A delivery boy once claimed he heard a child screaming behind the locked gates of the house, only for the sound to vanish as quickly as it came. A neighbor swore that on several occasions, he saw John pacing the balcony long after midnight, muttering to himself as if troubled by unseen forces. And yet, every morning the Whittakers reappeared polished and smiling, as though the night had erased every trace of darkness. What unsettled people most was the atmosphere around the home. Visitors often remarked that stepping onto the grounds filled them with a heaviness they could not explain, as if the walls of the house carried a memory of something unspeakable. The estate stood as a symbol of power, but it also radiated a silence that felt unnatural. Behind the beauty and grandeur, there seemed to be something else entirely, something locked away, waiting for the right moment to come into the light. The first real crack in the Whittakers' carefully built facade came with the disappearance of a woman who had been part of their household for years. Eleanor, a maid who had faithfully worked for the family for nearly a decade, was suddenly gone without a trace. One morning she simply failed to appear at her duties, and by evening, John Whittaker informed the neighbors that she had left for personal reasons. His explanation was delivered with such confidence that few dared to question it openly, but whispers began almost immediately. Eleanor's trunk, which contained her few personal belongings, was still in the servants' quarters, and her wages from the past month were found untouched in a small envelope. To those who noticed these details, her sudden departure seemed not only suspicious but impossible. The unease grew when people began recalling strange sights on the Whittaker estate around the time Eleanor vanished. Several neighbors remembered seeing John outside in the middle of the night, lantern in hand, digging in the soft earth near the back of the gardens. At first, they dismissed it as harmless. Perhaps he was planting or repairing something, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. The idea that the respected head of the household might be burying something in secret quickly spread in hushed tones. No one dared confront him directly, because John's reputation for authority and temper made such a confrontation unthinkable. Only weeks later, another servant abruptly left the household, this time of his own will. A groundskeeper who had only worked for the family for a short period departed without even collecting his final pay. When questioned by locals, he refused to explain his reasons, only shaking his head and muttering that he would never return to the Whittaker estate. His silence was even more haunting than if he had spoken, for it left the imagination free to fill in the gaps. What could he have seen or heard that frightened him so deeply? The absence of an answer only fueled speculation. Despite these troubling signs, the Whittakers maintained their spotless image in public. John continued his business dealings and made generous contributions to the town, while Margaret attended social gatherings with the same warm smile she had always worn. To anyone looking from the outside, the family was unshaken, as though nothing had happened at all. This ability to mask reality was perhaps their greatest strength, for it kept suspicion from turning into action. People may have whispered, but they lacked the courage to accuse a family that held so much power. Yet not everyone was convinced by appearances. Some in the community began quietly keeping track of who came and went from the estate. Over the years, a pattern emerged. Servants were hired, stayed for a short time, and then either disappeared or left abruptly with no explanation. Each departure was brushed aside by the Whittakers with a new excuse, but those who paid attention began to sense something deeply wrong. Still, fear kept them silent. The grand house continued to stand tall and commanding, but for those who knew its secrets, it became less a symbol of success and more a place of dread. Every missing servant was another shadow added to the family's history, another unanswered question buried beneath layers of charm and wealth. The cracks in the perfect image were beginning to widen, and the darkness inside the Whittaker home was slowly seeping outward, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. The Whittaker children were the most unsettling piece of the family puzzle. At first glance, they appeared polite, quiet, and perfectly mannered, which only reinforced the image their parents worked so hard to project. But those who looked closer saw details that were harder to ignore. The children's complexions were pale, almost sickly, and their eyes carried a hollow expression that seemed unusual for one so young. While other children in the town laughed and played in the fields, the Whittaker children were rarely seen outside the estate walls. On the rare occasions they appeared in public, they moved in stiff unison, never straying far from their mother's side, as though freedom itself was forbidden. Teachers at the local school began to notice troubling patterns. The Whittaker children performed well in their lessons, but their work carried disturbing undertones. Instead of writing simple stories about animals or adventures, they often turned in compositions filled with shadows, locked doors, and hidden figures. Their drawings were no different. Crude sketches of graves, chains, and crying faces were scrawled across their papers. When questioned, they gave no explanation, simply lowering their heads and falling into silence. Once, one of the daughters, no older than 10, whispered to a classmate that her family kept secrets in the cellar. The teacher dismissed it as childish imagination, but the words lingered, whispered from one student to another until the story spread beyond the schoolyard. Visitors to the estate noticed the same eerie patterns. A neighbor delivering food to the household claimed to hear muffled cries coming from beneath the floorboards when he stood near the kitchen door. Another reported strange clanking sounds near the basement windows, the metallic rhythm resembling the dragging of chains. When asked about these noises, John and Margaret would laugh politely, insisting it was nothing more than the wind or the sounds of servants working. Their answers were delivered so smoothly that most people were left doubting themselves. Still, those who had heard the sounds firsthand could not shake the unease. The children's demeanor only deepened the mystery. They seldom spoke in public, and when they did, their words seemed rehearsed, as if they had been instructed on what to say. Their gazes were often directed downward, their hands folded tightly in their laps, and their voices barely above a whisper. It was as though they had learned at an early age that silence was safer than honesty. During one church service, a boy flinched violently when his father placed a hand on his shoulder, a reflex that did not go unnoticed by those sitting nearby. The moment was brief, quickly covered with a forced smile, but it raised questions in the minds of those who saw it. By now, the whispers in town had taken on a darker tone. People speculated about what might be happening behind the locked doors of the estate. Some claimed the children were being punished harshly, others suggested they were witnesses to secrets too horrifying to speak aloud. But no one dared to act. The Whittaker family's influence still held the community in its grip, silencing any thought of investigation. And so the children continued to grow in the shadow of their parents' control, carrying with them the heavy burden of secrets that no one was yet willing to uncover. The unraveling of the Whittaker family's carefully constructed world came on a storm-soaked night in 1924. Lightning split the sky above the estate, illuminating the house in stark flashes that made its grand columns and darkened windows look more like the walls of a mausoleum than a home. It was during this storm that a passerby noticed smoke rising in thick plumes from the roof. At first, He thought the storm had sparked the fire, but as the flames grew stronger, it became clear that something more sinister had taken root. The town's fire brigade was quickly summoned, racing through sheets of rain to reach the sprawling estate, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited inside. The front of the house was already engulfed, the fire chewing through the walls and threatening to collapse the structure. Firefighters rushed in, breaking through doors, calling out for survivors, and guiding the frightened Whittaker children who had been discovered huddled near an upstairs hallway. They were pale, shaking, and far too thin, their clothes hanging loosely from their frail frames. What disturbed the rescuers most was not only their condition, but also the way the children seemed hesitant to leave, as though stepping outside the house might unleash consequences worse than the flames. They were eventually carried out, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. As the fire crews pressed deeper into the house, they stumbled upon a heavy wooden door in the basement, its surface scorched but still intact. It took several men to break it open, and what they found behind it would forever scar their memories. The basement was divided into narrow chambers, more like prison cells than storage rooms. The walls were lined with chains, manacles, and rusted locks, and the air carried the suffocating stench of decay. In one of the rooms lay the skeletal remains of at least 3 people, their identities lost to time. The discovery confirmed every rumor that had haunted the town for years. The firefighters searched frantically, pulling open every door, but much of the evidence had already been consumed by the flames. Still, the layout of the basement told its own story. Small windows boarded shut, heavy doors bolted from the outside, and claw marks etched into the wooden beams. Whoever had been trapped in those rooms had fought desperately for freedom. The horror of what the Whittakers had hidden beneath their perfect exterior became undeniable. When the fire was finally subdued, questions turned to John and Margaret. Neither could be found in the wreckage. Some speculated that their bodies had been reduced to ash, but others insisted they had fled into the night, abandoning their children to face the chaos. Rumors of sightings soon surfaced in nearby towns, but nothing was ever confirmed. What remained behind was a gutted, blackened shell of a home and the chilling confirmation that the whispers had been true all along. The night of fire had not only destroyed the Whittaker estate, it had unmasked the darkness that had been festering within its walls for years. The aftermath of the fire marked the beginning of one of the most notorious scandals of the 20th century. The once admired Whittaker estate, reduced to little more than charred beams and smoldering rubble, became the focus of national headlines almost overnight. Newspapers called it a house of horrors, and journalists traveled from across the country to uncover the story of how a family so celebrated could conceal such unthinkable evil. The town that had once praised the Whittakers as paragons of refinement and wealth was now thrown into shame, its people haunted by their own silence. Many admitted they had seen signs of darkness over the years, but none had dared to speak up, and that hesitation now weighed heavily on their consciences. The children, removed from the ruins that night, became central figures in the investigation. Malnourished and deeply traumatized, they struggled to speak about their experiences. What little they revealed confirmed what investigators suspected. The locked chambers in the basement were not a recent creation, but had been used for years. Some victims were servants, others outsiders who had gone missing without explanation. The Whittaker parents had created a system of cruelty hidden beneath the mask of family respectability, and the children had lived under its shadow since birth. Their strange drawings, their fearful behavior, and their silence all made sense now, as if their small voices had been trying to tell the story long before the fire forced the truth to light. Authorities searched tirelessly for John and Margaret, but no trace of them was ever found in the wreckage. While some experts insisted their bodies had simply burned beyond recognition, others doubted this, pointing to the fact that the couple had both the wealth and foresight to escape before the blaze consumed the house. Reports trickled in for years afterward. Sightings of a man and woman resembling the Whittakers in distant towns, always living under assumed names, always vanishing when suspicion grew too strong. None of these leads ever produced answers, and their fate remained one of the most chilling mysteries tied to the case. As the story spread, fascination with the Whittaker family grew into something almost mythic. Writers speculated on their motives, some suggesting madness passed down through generations, others pointing to greed, control, or hidden cult practices. Theories became part of the legend, but no single explanation ever satisfied the public's curiosity. The surviving children were placed with distant relatives and lived their lives away from the spotlight, yet rumors continued to follow them, with people claiming they carried the weight of their parents' sins wherever they went. The estate itself was eventually torn down, the land left barren, as if no one wanted to risk building upon ground so deeply scarred. Still, those who passed by claimed to feel an unnatural heaviness in the air, and stories spread of strange noises on stormy nights, the sound of chains rattling or faint cries carried by the wind. Whether these were echoes of memory or simply the imagination of a frightened community, they ensured the Whittaker name was never forgotten. More than a century later, the Whittaker family's story remains a chilling reminder of how darkness can thrive in plain sight. Beneath their polished image lay cruelty, confinement, and secrets so terrible they shook an entire generation. Their case became a symbol of hidden evil lurking behind closed doors, a cautionary tale of how appearances deceive and silence allows horrors to grow unchecked. Even now, the question lingers. Did John and Margaret Whittaker perish in the flames, or do they still rest somewhere in unmarked graves, their secrets buried with them? The answer remains elusive, but the shadow they cast over history endures, a haunting legacy of terror that refuses to fade.